As quilters, we love fabric. We get fabric, we cut fabric, we put it together and make beautiful quilts. But there's always a few pieces left over, so we cut those pieces of fabric and put them back together and make a beautiful quilt. And this can go on a few times until what we have left are just minuscule little pieces we simply don't know what to do with. Well, I have an idea for you here. We're going to take some of that fabric that we have left over from other quilts, put it together, cut it first, and then make a quilt. So we're going to take our scraps that are already cut, we're going to put them back together, cut them one more time, and make a gorgeous quilt. You're going to love this. I'm Leah Louise from Inspired Quilting by Leah Louise, and I want to show you how to make a quarter log cabin square. This is absolutely beautiful and so much fun and so forgiving and incredibly easy. You don't want to miss this. It's a great block to have in your tool belt. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm ready to quilt, but first, please don't forget, give me a thumbs up and subscribe. I'd love to have you join me in the future. So let's get started. I'm ready to show this quilt to you right now. And here's the beginning of scrap quilt number 5. I'm going to make the quarter log cabin, and everywhere that I've seen and the patterns that I've looked at all show it done in a single square with a center in one corner and then the other pieces going around it at a 90-degree angle. What I want to do is use a center, and I'm going to use a charm square, a 5-inch center, and then I'm going to just make a really large log cabin that I'm then going to cut in quarters, and I'll get that same quadrant and that same look. Now, there's a couple different things about how I'm going to do it, and I'll show you as I go. I figure this is going to probably take about a full jelly roll. These are all scraps of recent quilts. You'll probably recognize a lot of these fabrics. And I have a dozen charm squares. I think a dozen of these large blocks is exactly what I need. And they're each going to have 4 rows in the log cabin around the center, which will then be cut into quarters. So instead of trying to piece all the lengths in these different colors, what I'm going to do is take this particular group and sew them all together end to end. And then that way, as I'm going along, all I have to do is pick up one of the color strips and just start sewing it around. And the beauty is that even though these may connect end to end and they're going to have a seam in there, which I'll do the diagonal bias seam like we do for a binding strip, it's going to look great because the colors are similar. It's going to be a diagonal seam. It's going to really blend well. And most of these colors are, similar family groups. There's a lot of graphics, prints, etc. in here, but that's okay. It's going to work fine. And this is where I am. So let me go ahead and I'll get the first block done so I can show you how this will go together, and then we're going to get a quilt made. I want to talk log cabins in general before we get started on today's project. Just because there's a couple techniques that I used in this quilt that I'm using in today's quilt as well, and I just want to share that with you as a reminder and to give you a better visual of what it's going to look like. When I made this, I sewed all my strips together in long pieces. Instead of cutting everything individually to size, I took all my greens and I sewed them in a long piece. I took the blue purples and in a long piece. I did the turquoise. And so that way, as I'm sewing, I'm just running through. I don't have to stop and change. But I want you to see is, for example, right here, get some thread in there too, but here's a diagonal seam. And I sew it just the same way I do for seam binding, for quilt binding, and it works really well. Like, see, here's an angle, and here they are. But see, they're elusive, right? They don't stand out that much. and they work really well. It's a great way to blend your strips together. Now, you can certainly do it with the straight pieces, but for me, because there's so many 90-degree corners in here in the log cabin to begin with, I didn't want to have more along the way that may throw the pattern off and make it look a little bit uneven. So I wanted to add this because I think it just adds a really nice look. Now, this quilt I made a month or two ago. I've lost track, and I'll put the video link up above because I'll show you how to go ahead and do that with all your strips if you haven't done that before, and you can see how this quilt was pieced. This also uses two different size logs. So we have the 2.5 inch finishes at 2, and then a 1.5 inch, or excuse me, a 2 inch that finishes at 1.5. So that's what this quilt is. So I want to show you that. I have another one. Oh, and I just love this. You may have heard me talk about, may have seen my pattern called the Garden Path. And the original one was done with a K facet. Oh my goodness, what was the green? I think it's Ecuador, with the lime greens and oranges, and oh, the colors are just magnificent. And it turned out great. I really, really liked it. And what I did is create an asymmetrical rail fence. So we have our charm in the middle, and we do our block, but then we get the big piece out here. And this is perfect for focal fabrics, or if you want to do some really creative quilting. You have some wonderful space here. Now, I love these prints. What do you think about these black and whites? The K facet are awesome, no question about it. But these are Allie K Design. She's out of Dallas, Texas, and her fabrics are gorgeous. I don't remember what these are called, but I'll put the link for this quilt up above as well, and you can go and see how this went together. But the links for her fabric or her website, I think, is in there. And it's a fun quilt, but I just want you to get a feel for what kind of design opportunities there are with a log cabin block. It doesn't have to be a continuous row after row after row of strips. You can be really creative. You can use different colors and different sizes and, put it off center. And there's so many more I want to do. I'm really getting hooked on this. I'm telling you, I have had so much fun. Let me just show you this block on the end. So this is actually a 9-patch quilt, 9 blocks, 3 by 3. And if I have enough fabrics, enough fabric to do 4 more blocks, I'm going to put this on point. I think that would be absolutely stunning. But here's some more, just to get a view of the fabrics. It's wonderful. I just want to get my markers out and color these in. I'm like a kid. I want to color in the pretty pictures. So, but it's a great fun pattern. And I think it's something that you might enjoy. It's probably about the easiest log cabin that you'll find because the pieces are big. And like I said, it's wonderful for focal fabric as well as for quilting. Okay, that's what I wanted to show you, is we can be really creative. And I'm showing you this for a reason, because this next quilt that we're going to make now is kind of out there. It's different. And it's called a quarter log cabin, and I'm not even doing it the way it's supposed to be. We're going to go ahead and take it on a new journey, but we're going to start. I did my first 6 here, so I had all my strips. I have 2 sets basically of colors. I divided them into 2 groups just so that I would have some variance and not everything would be too matchy-matchy. Love these dots. Remember these from a few quilts ago? Oh gosh, I love them. So I use a 5-inch center, and then I just start winding round and round. I went ahead and let's see here. Here's my strips. So see how I just run them all together and I did the 1/4 inch, or excuse me, the 90-degree turn like that to go ahead and sew it, and make one long stretch. And then as I'm going around the block, I'm going to get some of these angles, but I really like it. Now this only has 2 rows, so I stopped here to trim everything because I want to make sure they stay at least relatively square. Now here's a fun one. Let's get a few pieces here. But you know, we get the little bits of the angles, and I just think it adds so much charm, and it's just kind of fun. Don't you love the big dots and little dots? That just worked out great. Here's a pretty one. I like this. Those kind of tealy colors. Whoa, and then this one is a bright one. So I'm on row 2. I have 2 more rows on each of those to go, and then we're going to start cutting them apart, and I'll show you how this quilt goes together. I want to show you how this block goes together, and I have my first set of strips in a specific colorway, and I'm going to join them all together. Now I start with the smaller pieces first. The reason I do that is as I'm adding these strips to my block, the innermost rows are going to be the shortest, so I'll get more bang for my buck. In other words, I'll see more of this around my center square in the smaller close-up rounds of the log cabin than I would on the outer edges. And so these are the longer pieces that are, you know, either full width of fabric or whatever the case may be, whatever's available. So let me go ahead, and I want to show you how these go together. And we'll start with this one first. And in these, I do have some that are the same color. And ordinarily, I would interchange them throughout so that I can mix it up. But in this case, because like I said, they're going to be in the center of the quilt where the rounds are shorter. Oops, I got my thread. There we go. Where the rounds are shorter. I guess I can't sew and talk at the same time. Sorry about that. Then I want to have more of a round, a full circle, so to speak. Now, I didn't get the selvages off on all of these, so I'm just going to trim them as I go. But what I want to show you is I'm putting these together just as I would my quilt binding. And so I lay this right side up, I put this right side down, and I put them at a 90-degree angle like this, and I'm going to sew from corner to corner. Now, sometimes it's a little easier if you give yourself a little room here and here, because you want to be able to see that point right there. Let me get my little seam ripper. It makes a wonderful pointer. And I'm going to put my needle right in that notch, and I'm going to sew straight down here. If it's easier for you initially, if you're not, you know, comfortable with doing this and haven't done it before, go ahead and give yourself a little pencil line, or even press it, or finger press, whatever the case may be, and then you can sew along the line. But what I do is I put my needle right there, and I just line this up straight. And I want to make sure that I have a pretty even, there we go, a pretty even overlay right there, that, you know, if I go like this, I'm not going to get a nice straight binding because it's going to be crooked. It'll get there and then it'll actually angle out. Not unlike, you know, if you've ever done any clothing sewing and you take a dart, or you take a big seam in one place and a narrow in the other, you're not going to get equal edges. So we just want to try and keep things consistent, and then we're just going to go through and do one piece after the other. Now I'll do one more, and then I'll show you the next step. All right. Well, I'm sorry I didn't cut these selvages off. It was kind of a mad rush going through all these fabrics and saying, yes, that'll work, and then getting it figured out. Okay, so line it out, and there we go. Now, once I'm finished with this, what I would then do is I'm just going to come back and I'm going to cut these like this. Now, I'm saving those, and we'll talk about that here in a bit. I just, I love a little triangle, and we can make half square triangles and do some really fun scrap quilts with that. So we'll save that for another day, but I'm not throwing them away. So now you can see I have these nice straight pieces, and I'm just going to be able to use this to go ahead and put my my rows around my log cabin, and there we go. So let's go ahead and do the first row. With my strips all sewn together, I'm going to start adding rounds of fabric to my block. So I'm going to take my center charm square, and I'm just going to line this up. Now when I have the pinked edges like that, I do let it overhang a little bit. And let's see, I'm going to put this here and come all the way down here. And seam allowance is important here in that you need to make sure you're consistent in order to have your blocks come out square. So just keep that in mind. Now at this point you can do things a couple different ways. I cut as I go, and what I do is I'll lay this down like this and cut, or I'll hold it in my hand. But as I'm cutting, what I want to be able to do is, see how I'm leaving like about 1/8 of an inch there? Just a little bit, so that when I turn this over, I don't have a shortage. I have enough that I can go ahead and line this up. Now, I'm not going to necessarily line it up with that corner because I overcut the corner, but what I am going to do is bring this strip even with my 5-inch block. Now, I want to make sure that this corner is higher than over here. For example, let's say, just for the sake of argument, let's just cut a piece of this off. And let's say this was cut uneven. And if I lined this up here and didn't pay attention to that, see how it's not quite even right there? It's short. Then when I roll this over and press it, my block is going to come over and then come down at an angle, and I won't get a square. So line your edge up with your charm square, with your 5-inch square, and make sure this extends above that rail that we just put in. Rail or log or strip or whatever we're going to call it. With my strip lined up along the edge and my top above that row there, so that I know I'm not going to be cutting myself short, I'll line up this edge and I'm going to just let it go straight, and it's going to lay across the excess. So we can come back and trim that, or it can just get worked into the pressing. Now I'm also going to make sure that all my seams are going out to the outer edge, away from the center. It's going to just make it easier to press later and to sew if everything's going in the same direction. And again, we want to just make sure our seam allowances are even and lined up the way we want. So at this point, what I would do, and I really did that intentionally, I could just come back and I'm going to trim it. But I'm still going to leave a little bit there. I'm not trimming it all the way to that edge, because when I turn the fabric, when I fold it over, if something isn't exactly in place, then it could create a problem that I'm going to either end up short with fabric at a seam point, or have an unsquare finished block. All right, so I've done two sides. Now I'm getting to a point where I have my join, where I've joined the two together, and I'm going to go ahead and line this up. Line it with the side, make sure it's overhanging just a little bit, doesn't need to be a lot. This seam allowance is facing towards the needle, which is the outside edge of my block. And we're just going to run this, and I'm going to hold my finger right there just to make sure that seam allowance stays where it needs to be. Now, we're going to be running off the edge, but that's okay. Don't worry about it. I'll show you what we're going to do here. And we're just going to go. I want to make sure I sew far enough that I'm off that edge. And just trim it up. And I'm going to turn it over, and I'm just going to cut this right here. And what I'm going to do is pull this little piece out. Now, you can certainly go ahead and sew it with this in there, but I don't want to have that extra bulk in the seam allowance unless it's for something real. This is just, you know, bulk in the middle that we don't want to include. So there we go. So I'm just going to take that little piece out, and I'm just going to trim this nice and straight, and we're back where we started. So turn this over, and we have it trimmed, and we have that little corner. Now, I kind of like when that happens, because then when I add this, it just adds some fun, because the fabric wraps around the corner. Now see this? See, if I didn't take a look at this, this corner is right in line, but this one is actually coming down just a little bit. Not a lot, but enough that if I just sort of rub, roll, rake, whatever you want to call, move that fabric up, slide it just a little bit, I'm going to get a much better seam. So we want to line it up with the side here with our 5-inch square, and then this is going to lay straight, and we're going to sew along this edge as our guide, because we know that's the straight line. We're not going to use the piece that we trimmed. We're going to tuck that seam allowance up there just to make sure that it's going in the direction that we want. And we're going to sew all the way down and across here. And let's just trim off some threads and some extra fabric. Turn this over and trim this off. Now, what I do is I save these extra shorter pieces, and when I get to the end of these blocks, I'm going to find I need a little filler here and there, and this is what I'm going to use. So we use every bit of this. Now, I'm going to trim this off because that's a particularly wide seam allowance, and I don't want to have that much right there, so I'll just cut that off. All right, so now we have our first round, and it looks wonderful. You can decide at this point if you want to press these or finger press them. Now, what I did is the first 2 rows I just finger press. Once I had the second round on, then I did press it with the iron, and I actually trimmed everything to the same size. And yours is going to vary. It'll depend on your seam allowance and how well you cut these. Did you cut them on the narrow side, the wider side, all those factors, but it's going to be plus or minus 12.5 to 13 inches. The finished block at the 2 levels. There's a lot of stages we're going through, and I just want to speak it in a way you can understand. Okay, so I'm finger pressing. I'm going to add row 2. Now I have to share with you, I have a new pair of glasses, and there's some salvage. Let's just stick that off the edge, and I'll cut that off after. And these glasses are affecting how I'm sewing this camera right here. I'm going to back up just a little bit. This camera is like right in front of me, and it's in front of my left eye, so I have to really work on using my right eye. And I'm left eye dominant. So if you see me like trying to reach for things and I'm reaching in the wrong place, that's what's going on. It's going to take some getting used to. But I'm managing. I'm getting there. The worst thing is that if I hit the camera and everything goes flying. But hopefully that won't happen. Okay. I have to kind of close my left eye every once in a while so that I'm not totally destroying things. Okay, so here we are. I digress. And I come around the corner, and I'm going to go ahead and trim this off, leaving just, you can't see that, trim that off, leaving just a little bit, and fold it over, finger press it, and then I'm going to add my next round. And let's see, make sure we go, oh, and see, so this is one that I actually connected 2 of the same, because I wanted just to keep this color together, and they were shorter pieces to begin with. I don't want the transition of these fabrics to be too short. Now I'm going to show you something. Do you see this? If I line this up along a line, well, we're going to use this straight line. We go from here to here. Do you see how that pokes in a little bit? I did not exactly get that perfectly straight, and or, you know, I didn't finger press it well. When you get little I guess a divot, for lack of a better word, like that, you can work around it, and you just need to be careful as you're laying it. Go with your straightest piece. So the first thing we're going to do is put this up so that the fabric is up there. Now you can see how it's wanting to turn at an angle. But luckily, with this seam, we do have some flexibility that we can manipulate and direct just where we want this to go. So I'm going to put this here. I'm going to line this side up with my previous row so I know this is straight. I have my fabric here where I want it, and I'm going to just bring this over, get those threads out of the way. I'm going to bring this over just a little bit, and I'm going to sew in line with this. There we go. And then as I get here, I'm just going to tuck this over a little bit. And it's not much. It wasn't off by a lot. But what it can, you know, the problem that you can have is in your next round is that as you're sewing along, you may have, instead of a nice straight seam, you could have something, you know, poking out that's going to wreak havoc and trying to make a square block. So we're here. And the advantage, too, of having this little 1/8 inch bit hanging over is you can see when you get to the end of your seam, your row, so you know where you're stopping. Okay, so I'm going to come back here. I don't need to trim too much off of that. And we're going to put this way. And now I'm going to come here. And I have a piece. Now, I really like the look. Oops, I pulled out my thread there, sorry. I really like the look of when the corners change color. Now, if this seam were going to be right exactly like in the corner, and all these seams were going to converge in one place, if that's too much for you, just cut it off. I fold it over and cut it off. That way I can use it as a half square triangle later on. So when you have you know, a corner situation, you're not sure what to do, go ahead and cut it off if it makes you uncomfortable, or if it complicates things, or if it gets too bulky. So let me go ahead and thread this needle. All right, we've got thread in the needle. We're ready to come back and look at how this is going to line up. I'll line this up with the edge, put that up above. Now, the other situation you may find is if your strips are not exactly the same width. Now, some of these are pre-cut, others are ones that I've cut, and if I'm cutting them at different times, well, they're going to be off, you know, a smidge here and there, and that's okay. You know, we can work through that. We are humans, and not everything is as precise as we would like it sometimes. So I'm going to go ahead and line this up, and I'm going to line this up right here. My seam will come down, and then what I'll do is bring this edge up here. So I'm going to put it where it should be. Sometimes it's simply that the seam doesn't want to let the fabric lay flat, because remember, we're dealing with a bias, because this is a 45-degree seam. And I want to make sure my seam underneath is going that direction. But a bias seam can stretch the fabric, and we want to make sure that we don't allow it to stretch our strips so that they're not nice and straight. All right, so I'm making sure my seams are going in the same direction as I want, and this is one of the corner pieces that I added, so that seam is also going to go to the outside. Right there. All right, one more round, and then we'll be at a point where we can press this and trim it, and then move on to the last 2 rounds. So there we go. And so what I do is each round I try to keep in the same color group, not necessarily the same fabrics or even exactly the same color, but like I'm doing, this is sort of pink colors, these were teal colors. My concern with this particular quilt and the block and how it's put together and being a scrappy quilt is you can get too scrappy sometimes and you don't see the design, and I really want to see that design here. All right, this is another point I want to show you, and I know it's minuscule. Can you see that little bit right there? I have this corner lined up to the top edge, but this one is down below, so I need to push that up. This corner will go above and this will go below. I'm cutting these by hand with a pair of scissors when I'm sitting here. First, the reason I cut it is to make it easier. If I were to stop and cut each one, that could be, a lot of time and effort. Secondly, I'm cutting it a little over where I need it to be in order to allow that row to flip and have enough fabric for the next round. So there are a couple factors playing into this that can affect just how that seam is going to line up. But the alternative is cutting everything to size. Because when you do it that way, and a lot of folks make a log cabin by cutting every strip individually, your block's going to have a much better chance of coming out, perfectly square, because everything is preset and pre-sized to make sure that you have just exactly what you need and what you want. But I don't want to take that time. All right, I want to show you one thing here too. See how this corner went in a little bit? Right there, you can see. Now, I still have pretty close to 1/4 of an inch, and this protrudes past 1/4 of an inch. It depends on your confidence and ability to keep your seam where it needs to be and not be sidetracked by other things going on. For example, this pink piece is hanging over just a little bit because this edge goes this way. And that's why I line my straight edge of my strip with this 5-inch square, and then as this falls, I know that's where I need to sew. So that's what I'm doing, if you're wondering why, I have that bit of a gap there. But that's okay, it's not going to be a problem. And right here, we now have our block. Now, this is kind of fun. When this is cut, remember, we're going to cut these crossways to make a 1/4 log cabin block. This is going to be in that top corner, which I think is really going to give it a fun look. All right, so here we are. I'm going to press this. I'll trim it to make sure it's right where it needs to be. And then we will go ahead and add the last 2 rows, and we're good to go. So let me show you how this is going to come together. And here's one of the finished blocks with 4 rows all the way out. Unfortunately, I can't get the whole block on the screen, but what I want to show you is how we're going to cut this into quadrants. And we need to cut it through the center square so that this is equal. We could easily just fold this over and, mark a line and cut it through, but we don't want this to be off center where one is wider than the other. It gets lopsided, because that's going to have an effect on the overall look of the quilt. So what I'm going to do here is line my ruler up, and this is 4.5 inches finished. That was a 5-inch square that we started with. So it'll finish at 5.5, excuse me, at 4.5, and I want to cut it so it's 2.25 inches. But in order to be sure that I'm accurate, I'm going to put this ruler over here, because if my seam allowance was off and maybe my square ended up at being 4.25, then if I take 2.25 over here, this side is going to come up short. So basically what we're doing is we're going to find the middle. And I'm going to put this ruler in. I'm lining vertically as well as horizontally. And I have my line right here at my 2.25, and I have this one at 2.25, and they line up really well. So I'm okay on this one. But if I had found that, let's say, this was too small, then I would split the difference and I would slide this so I have an equal amount here and here. This is just a backup to make sure that everything is nice and straight and equally measured so that we aren't going to run into problems. So we've cut it in half that way, and now we're going to do it in the other direction. Now, I'm not sure just how I'm going to do this, as the camera might get in the way. So let me see what we can do. Again, we're going to line up, and what I'm doing is taking this 1/4 inch mark, and I'm putting 2 of them alongside my center square. So that way I know this is nice and straight. And I'm doing the same thing with this ruler. Oh, but notice, I only have 1 3/4. I hit the wrong quarter. There we go. That's why a second ruler is also helpful, is it keeps you from making silly mistakes. So we're making sure that our lines on the grid are following the lines of the block. And I need to take this in just a little bit. So I'm at 1/4 here and 1/4 here. So now I'm going to cut from one end to the other. And, whoops, there we go. All the way here. And I can't quite get to that tip because the camera stand is in the way. Long story, but we'll deal with that later. Okay, so I now have 4 blocks. What's interesting is just how different each of them look. And, they have this same center, so we've got that bright center. But, this has a dark green, and this one has a brighter green. And we tuck this one in here. And, so this is how the quilt is set up. It's at an angle like this. Now, what I want to show you is what some of the others look like as well. And so here's a group, and I cut them apart. And again, like here we go. If we're putting our quilt together, they're going to be side to side like this. And we'll have one up here, and we'll have one down here. And I just, it's really fun to see how all this is going to come together. We put this one over here. But the idea is that this center corner square is always in the same place for all the blocks. And that's what the 1/4 square quilt is based on, is it's 1/4 and it has this common center block in the same location. Now, one thing that I have also seen with the quarter log cabin is generally the rows are always the same. So if this row, you see how this is purple, and it sort of just worked out that way. But on this variation, where's another one of these? Over here. This variation has different purples, different greens, and this one's pretty much the same, different purples kind of falling in and through. So by keeping your basic color scheme in the same row, your quilts will have some continuity, which makes everything easier on your eye, yet it's still going to have a lot of interest, and you're going to have a lot of variance throughout your blocks. So let me show you this other, I think I have another few stacks here. I have a few more to make. Obviously, we're not going to be able to finish this quilt today. We're well over half an hour. And you can see I'm not nearly there yet. Look at how fun these are. I love these prints. Do you remember the log cabin out of those prints? That's so pretty. And the big dots. Oh my goodness, a lot of my favorite fabrics are in here. That's the fun of working with scraps. You get to enjoy those favorites all over again. And here we are. Now I have some ideas about how I'm going to piece these all together. And I'll do that in the next video because we're certainly not going to get it done today. But this is where we are, and I hope you have the opportunity to try one of these. Even if it's just a single large block, cut it down, and then kind of repiece it, play with it, see what you can come up with. And it's a lot of fun. It's a great way to use your scraps, and it's just a beautiful, beautiful group of colors, and it's really going to be a great quilt. All right, so here we go. Let me go ahead and get this finished up for next time. And until then, enjoy. Get lots of quilting finished. Oh, and please don't forget, sign up. Give me a thumbs up. And I want to see you next time. I can't wait to share this with you. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much.